The paramedic became emotional, trying to save the life that was already gone.
I do remember picking up, sorry. I picked up the little girl and she was limp, she was cold. Sorry.
She was just 4 years old, just a toddler, but her small frame showed signs of hardship and fear far beyond her years. And the most heartbreaking part? That suffering came from those meant to care for her. Leliana Wright didn't stand a chance. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, a woman who had lost everything to addiction and criminal behavior, was supposed to be her safe haven. Instead, she became the source of Leliana's suffering. Charles Wayne Pfeiffer, Jerry's boyfriend, was supposed to be a protector, but instead, he helped shatter her world into pieces. This is the story of a little girl, barely old enough to know how to protect herself, trapped in a hell she didn't deserve. But this isn't just a story about abuse. This is a story about the breakdown of every system that should have kept Leliana safe. About a broken mother who couldn't protect her daughter, a brutal man who tormented her, and a system too overwhelmed to notice the clear signs of a child in danger. But don't think you know how it ends. This is a twisty, painful journey through betrayal, systemic failures, and the heartbreaking aftermath of a tragedy that could have been prevented. You'll hear from the people who tried to save her, and those who didn't even try. From the detectives who pieced together the tragedy, and the family who fought for her life. And when it's all said and done, we're left with one disturbing question. How did no one see it coming? How did no one save her? But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. Leliana Wright came into this world on January 22, 2012, in Galveston, Texas. But her first moments on Earth were already steeped in the shadow of neglect. Her mother, Jerry Quezada, wasn't there to cradle her or whisper loving words into her ear. Instead, Jerry was in prison, serving a 6-year sentence for burglary. A mother's bond with her newborn should be instinctual, yet for Leliana, it was non-existent in those early, crucial days. Leliana's father, Brian Maker, wasn't in a position to care for her either. It was too much for him. So, Leliana was sent to live with her paternal grandparents, Elise and Craig Clackley, a couple who, despite not being her biological parents, took on the role of raising her. They didn't hesitate to give their granddaughter the love and stability she needed. They made her feel safe. Their home became her world. The Clackleys treated Leliana like their own daughter. They provided her with everything she needed: a warm bed, home-cooked meals, and most importantly, affection. Elise would be the one to show her how to walk, how to talk, how to laugh. Craig would play with her in the backyard, making sure she was surrounded by comfort. The couple made sure that, despite the odds, Leliana's world was full of love and joy. She thrived under their care. She laughed freely, a bright, joyful sound that could fill any room. She played in the yard, running through the grass, and for a while, there was peace in her little world. Leliana's favorite pastime? Singing. She loved 10 Little Monkeys Jumping on the Bed, a song so full of rhythm and joy that it seemed to fit the innocence of her childhood perfectly. And she loved the animals, especially the chickens that roamed around the backyard. Her world, though small, was full of happiness, a happiness she deserved but could not always hold on to. But as the saying goes, when the storm comes, the rain falls hard. Every few months, the Clackleys would take Liliana to visit her mother in prison. Jerry, despite her troubled past, was still Liliana's mother. And the Clackleys, though they knew the pain and trauma Jerry had caused in her own life, didn't want to cut that bond. They understood that no matter what Jerry had done, she was still her mother. Liliana, for her part, would sit with her mother during these visits, her face sometimes showing confusion, sometimes sadness, but always a glimmer of love for the woman who had given her life. But these visits were more than just visits. They were a reminder of the struggles that would shape Liliana's life. They were a reminder that her mother, despite all the help and care Liliana was getting from her grandparents, wasn't really capable of being there for her. Because Jerry Quezada wasn't just a woman who had made one mistake. Her life was a series of reckless decisions, all of which built a history of pain, neglect, and destruction. Jerry's story is not one of a single lapse in judgment. It's one of a life lived in the shadows, filled with choices that led her down a dark path. Before Liliana's birth, Jerry's history was riddled with substance abuse, criminal offenses, and domestic violence. Her first children had been taken from her, not once, but multiple times. Child Protective Services had intervened long before Liliana was born, removing her older children from her care due to neglect. Those children went to live with their father, leaving Jerry alone, in a life that was getting out of control. By the time Liliana came into the world, Jerry had already been arrested for driving under the influence of alcohol, and drug possession had become a common theme in her life. It wasn't just the one-time mistakes, it was the ongoing neglect. By 2010, Jerry was serving time in prison for burglary, and that's where Liliana was born, in a cold, sterile hospital wing behind bars. But when December 2013 rolled around, Jerry was released from prison on parole. No longer locked behind bars, she regained custody of Liliana, the child she had failed even before her birth. No one seemed to question the logic behind it. The system handed Liliana back to the woman who couldn't care for her. And in the blink of an eye, the little girl who had known only love, joy, and safety with her grandparents was thrown back into a world of uncertainty and danger. The question is, why? Why was a child who had already been taken from her mother handed back to the very person who couldn't protect her? This is where the system failed, and where Liliana's nightmare began. When Jerry regained custody, she was already deep in the grip of addiction. Her drug use didn't stop. Instead, it resumed with a vengeance. She had already been a prisoner to drugs, and now, without the watchful eyes of those who had been invested in her recovery, she fell back into that same cycle of substance abuse. But worse, she dragged Liliana back into that toxic world. Jerry's world was one of chaos, lies, and addiction, and now Liliana was once again exposed to it all. CPS, despite receiving multiple reports about Jerry's ongoing drug use, failed to act. Liliana's paternal grandparents, Elise and Craig Clackley, were raising alarms. They reported that Jerry was using drugs during her pregnancy with Liliana's younger brother. Despite knowing that Jerry was unstable, despite knowing that Liliana was in harm's way, no one came to take her away. The court failed to intervene, and Liliana remained stuck in a house filled with anger, drugs, and emotional neglect. And that's when Charles Wayne Pfeiffer entered the picture. Jerry's new boyfriend, introduced in September 2015, brought a history of violence and criminality into the home. Charles had his own dark past, charges of domestic abuse and neglect. Yet somehow, the system allowed him to become a fixture in Liliana's life. His influence was nothing but negative, and he became a major player in the abuse Liliana would soon face. He was a man with no regard for the young girl's well-being, and his volatile behavior only added to the already toxic environment in that home. Liliana's once bright and carefree world began to crumble. She showed signs of fear when returning home to her mother. She began throwing tantrums, becoming withdrawn, responding to the environment around her in ways that spoke volumes. She was terrified. A little girl, just 4 years old, had no words to express the anxiety that gripped her. Instead, her behavior was the silent cry for help that went unheard. By February 23, 2015, the bruises started to show. Alice Clackley, Liliana's grandmother, saw the marks on her granddaughter's face, cuts that no child should have. Alice took action, reporting the injuries to CPS. During a CPS interview, Liliana, scared and hesitant, disclosed that her mother had hit her. But even then, the investigation ended without any meaningful action. It was clear that Liliana was caught in a whirlwind of abuse and neglect. But somehow, despite the reports, despite the bruises, nothing changed. Liliana remained in that unsafe environment, surrounded by people who couldn't or wouldn't protect her. In the rare moments she was allowed to leave the chaos of her mother's home, her grandfather, Craig Clackley, would take her out, offering her a fleeting sense of safety. Liliana would smile when she was with him, a brief moment of peace amidst the storm. But when it was time to go back to her mother, reality would hit again, and her spirit would crack. The fear was too much for such a small child.
CPS caseworkers are agents that should be treated no differently than police officers.
According to the lawsuit, CPS received 29 calls in 1 week from people concerned Liliana was being abused. One CPS worker never made face-to-face contact with Liliana, and a special investigator following up took no action after realizing the family was not home.
There are people out there that did not do their job.
One of the most telling moments of Liliana's terror came when Jerry tried to take her back into her care. As Jerry walked into the room to collect her, Liliana's eyes widened, her little body frozen in fear. She clung to her grandfather, trembling, begging, too young to understand why she felt so unsafe. At that moment, she wasn't just a little girl who didn't want to leave the playground. She was a child who had been through enough pain to know what was coming. Then Elise tried to get custody of the girl, but they just told them to settle things out of court without even reading through the case, submitted, and Jerry's previous history.
In October 2014, 2 months before the scheduled hearing, CPS already had a report that Liliana's little half-brother was born with drugs in his system. And during that investigation, the children's mother tested positive on a drug test.
Despite all of this evidence existing, Clackley's attorney did not file any supporting documents with the court to back up his client's sworn statement. Despite Elisa Clackley's affidavit raising her concerns, her attorney advised her to come to an agreement outside of Haddock's courtroom.
He said, Elisa, if you go into her courtroom, or his exact words, you are going to lose everything. These attorneys were afraid, if you will, to go into her courtroom.
Both parties agreed to give Leliana's mother custody and guarantee the Clegley's visitation rights. As a result, the judge never heard the case, but signed off on the agreement. Clegley's attorney, Gregory Houseworth, declined to talk with us about why he advised Clegley not to go before Judge Haddock. Clegley filed a complaint with the Texas bar against Houseworth. She believes if there had been a hearing in the case, Leliana would be alive today.
Anytime harm comes to a child is frustrating, it's heartbreaking.
Judge Haddock was appointed by Judge William Harris. In April of last year, a month after Leliana's death, Judge Harris told us there was no court documentation of CPS's involvement, and that is possibly one reason why critical information did not come to light.
It certainly appears that there should have been a hearing on this case. It certainly appears that the court should have been given some evidence about the mother and about her circumstances. And I think it's tragic that the court never was allowed to hear that evidence.
On March 12, 2016, Leliana Wright's world, already filled with pain and terror, would turn into absolute horror. At just 4 years old, she had already endured more than most people will ever know. But on this day, her suffering would escalate to unimaginable heights. The trigger was something simple. Leliana vomited. She couldn't keep food down, and like any young child, she refused to eat. For most, this would be a sign of sickness, a cry for help. But for Jerry Quezada and Charles Wayne Pfeiffer, it became a reason to escalate their cruelty. They whipped Leliana, using a bamboo stick and a belt, each striking harder than the last. The marks they left on her body were not just physical. They were a symbol of something far darker. Leliana's tiny body, already battered from prior abuse, could no longer withstand the torment. But the cruelty didn't end there. In one horrifying act of rage, Charles grabbed Leliana by the throat, his fingers digging into her fragile neck as he slammed her against the wall. A little girl, barely 4 years old, was lifted by her throat and thrown like a rag doll. No child should ever face that kind of violence. But for Leliana, this was her reality. A reality where the people meant to care for her treated her like an object. Each moment, she must have felt her life slipping away, knowing that the people who should have loved her were the ones doing this to her. But it only got worse. The worst part came when Charles, wearing gloves, forcibly poured oral rehydration solution down Leliana's throat, adding to her trauma and pushing her fragile body to its limits. Later that same day, the abuse reached its most horrifying point. Leliana was found bound by her wrists in a closet, helpless, trapped in a small space like an animal. A haunting image, one that solidified the extent of the torment she was enduring. She wasn't just physically hurt, she was emotionally destroyed. She was isolated, terrified, and utterly alone. In those final hours, Jerry must have realized deep down that they had gone too far. But it didn't stop her from being complicit in the cruelty. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps she thought she could somehow fix what they had done. Jerry tried to bathe Leliana, but it was already too late. The small body she had abused and broken was no longer able to fight. Leliana collapsed, her spirit too shattered to keep going. She had been through too much. There was no more fight left in her. In a desperate attempt to save her daughter, Jerry performed CPR. She ordered Charles to call 911. But even at this point, when Leliana's life hung in the balance, Charles's indifference was chilling. His lack of urgency spoke volumes. His tone was calm, casual, as if he were discussing an everyday inconvenience. There was no panic, no frantic effort to save the child that had just been through hell. The moment Leliana collapsed, Charles's only concern seemed to be himself, his own self-preservation. During the 911 call, his detachment was clear, his words cold and emotionless. The dispatcher gave instructions, but it felt like no one was listening. Not truly. Charles wasn't rushing to help Leliana. He was more focused on making sure his own actions wouldn't come back to haunt him. By the time Jerry finally realized the extent of what had happened, it was far too late. When the authorities arrived at Leliana Wright's home on March 13, 2016, they were greeted by a scene of unimaginable horror. They found Leliana's lifeless body, a little girl barely 4 years old, lying cold and still, her small form a testament to the brutality she had endured. Bruises, ligature marks on her wrists, and the unmistakable signs of blunt force trauma littered her body. The violence was not just physical, it was an emotional assault too, the kind that no child should ever experience. And yet, this was Leliana's reality, right up until the moment she was taken from this world. Jerry Quezada, her own mother, stood there trying to cover up the truth. In the face of such clear evidence of abuse, Jerry still tried to spin a lie, claiming that Leliana slipped in the shower, as if that could explain the bruises, the swollen eyes, and the marks from being tied up. But her words rang hollow. The truth was already written in the bruises, in the way Leliana's body had been treated, in the terror she had lived through. Charles Wayne Pfeiffer, standing next to her, remained eerily calm, almost indifferent to the horror they had caused. Charles, who should have been frantic or remorseful, acted as though nothing had happened. His complete lack of emotion spoke volumes about his detachment from the pain they had inflicted. When the paramedic first arrived at the scene, he had no idea what he was about to face. He entered the home to find Leliana Wright lying on the floor, her small body cold and lifeless. The scene was so jarring that it stayed with him long after he had left. The medic described how Leliana's face was covered in bruises, with ligature marks around her wrists and other signs of blunt force trauma. The medics initially tried to resuscitate her on the spot, but the damage was too extensive. The paramedic recalled how, in that moment, he couldn't help but feel powerless. Leliana was just a child, a 4-year-old girl, but her body was a canvas of pain and violence. They didn't even wait for the ambulance to arrive. They immediately began CPR. But even as they rushed her to the hospital, it was clear that she was already gone. The medic's hands shook as he described how he carried her lifeless body into the ambulance, her head resting in his arms as if he could somehow protect her. Once they arrived at the hospital, the doctors worked for nearly 30 minutes, trying everything they could to resuscitate her, but there was no hope left. The paramedic spoke of how, during that time, the weight of the moment hit him. He couldn't escape the image of Leliana's small, broken body. She died in his arms, and that image stayed with him long after the incident. The paramedic admitted that, for the first time in his career, he had been completely overcome with emotion, knowing that they couldn't save her. He couldn't forget how she never stood a chance from the moment she entered that home. As the investigation unfolded, the layers of Leliana's abuse began to unravel. The autopsy results confirmed what everyone feared. Blunt force trauma to Leliana's head and abdomen had led to her death. She had been struck, kicked, and slammed with such force that it caused irreparable damage to her small body. The autopsy didn't just confirm the brutality of her death, it painted a vivid picture of the suffering Leliana had gone through. A child who had been beaten, tortured, and ultimately killed by the very people who should have been protecting her. But it didn't stop there. DNA evidence found under Charles's fingernails gave detectives the proof they needed. Leliana had fought back, and her DNA was found clutched in his nails. Further evidence came from marks on the wall, where Leliana had been slammed, leaving an imprint of the horror she had faced in her last moments. This evidence, clear and undeniable, tied Charles Wayne Pfeiffer directly to the abuse and the murder of Leliana. In the courtroom, Jerry's role in the tragedy became clearer. Though she pled guilty to felony child abuse, it was a small step toward acknowledging the suffering she had caused. In exchange for her guilty plea, Jerry testified against Charles. She admitted to her involvement, though she tried to shift much of the blame onto Charles, claiming he was the one who had caused most of the damage.
If I testify truthfully, then I will be sentenced to 50 years prison.
Her daughter, Jerry Casada, is awaiting sentencing after pleading guilty to felony injury to a child. Her live-in boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer, is facing a capital murder charge in Leliana's death. But Casada told Grand Prairie detectives that she too had been abusive.
How she would lose her temper and take things out on her. She talked about slapping her in the face. She had mentioned later on that she had even kicked her on several occasions as a form of discipline.
We have known for some time now that Leliana died an awful death.
She was severely beaten.
How would you describe it?
It was the worst thing I've ever seen inflicted on a child.
The child had been hung in the closet.
And her life was marked by violence and the massive failure of those whose duty it was to protect her. CPS, her mother, and the man she moved into their home.
That's when she explained how Charles grabs her by the throat, picks her up, pushes her into the wall, and begins to admonish her about throwing up, and then throws her into the closet and closes the door.
Jurors also heard testimony today that Casada and her boyfriend were using heroin on the night that Leliana was beaten to death. Charles Pfeiffer facing a possible life prison sentence without the possibility of parole if convicted. Testimony resumes tomorrow morning.
Jerry was sentenced to 50 years in prison. It was a sentence, but it felt like a small fraction of the punishment she truly deserved. After all, she was the one who had failed to protect her daughter, the one who had chosen the man who helped destroy her life.
For the first time, we learned the role this 31-year-old mother had in the torture and beating death of her own 4-year-old daughter.
Many of the injuries, but certainly not all, but many of the injuries that this child suffered, you admitted did come at your own hand. Is that right?
According to court records, the beating began after Leliana Wright drank her toddler brother's juice box. Jerry Casada and her boyfriend, Charles Pfeiffer, were high on heroin. Leliana was tied in a closet and then beaten with a belt and bamboo stick and thrown against a wall. The autopsy also revealed Leliana had been sexually abused.
There was an ample amount of time for you to try to get treatment on an immediate basis for those injuries. Is that right?
While Casada's crimes could carry a life sentence, she was instead sentenced to 50 years. She could be free after 25.
I think that if this case had gone to trial, I think that Ms. Casada would have certainly gotten a sentence of life.
The plea agreement means Casada will testify against her boyfriend at his upcoming trial. Dallas County District Attorney Faith Johnson, who hugged Leliana's grandmother at the hearing, praised prosecutors for the outcome. But Elisa Clakeley's initial response to the sentence.
It was like being hit with a ton of bricks for a split second.
In the end, she says she is satisfied with the plea deal.
There's been some form of justice for Leliana, and that was really my total objective, was just to see that she be put behind bars.
But it was Charles Wayne Pfeiffer's trial that would truly capture the world's attention. Charged with capital murder, Charles's defense team tried desperately to discredit Jerry's testimony, attacking her credibility in an effort to reduce his own culpability. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. From the DNA evidence to the marks on the wall, everything pointed to Charles.
Leliana was beaten to death, and yet there was something decidedly different about seeing the visual evidence of how horribly she suffered.
You see that she's got bruising, basically goes from the top of her back to below her knees.
So can you literally can beat a child to death?
You can beat anybody to death.
Dr. Mark Krause performed the autopsy on 4-year-old Leliana Wright, leaving the witness stand today to show jurors gruesome autopsy photos and explaining what they meant. The 4-year-old's entire body was covered in bruises, abrasions, and whip marks. Some of them, he testified, inflicted prior to the night she died. Dr. Krause called the whole body bruising, quote, death of 1,000 cuts, saying the cumulative effect of blood loss related to the severe bruising could be fatal. But he would ultimately tell jurors that Leliana died of, quote, blunt force trauma to her head and abdomen. She was hit or kicked so hard that her belly wall slammed into her spine. Jurors could be seen wiping away tears as they viewed evidence of how Leliana was brutally beaten before enduring the fatal blows. And then Dr. Krause summed it all up like this.
Was there intent to kill them? I don't know. Was there intent to injure them? We have very good evidence that there was. Did those injuries cause the death? No question. That's a homicide in our book.
The jury convicted him of capital murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His actions were beyond redemption, and the justice system had finally caught up with him. In the end, justice was served, but it didn't change the fact that Leliana Wright's life was stolen before it ever had the chance to truly begin. Her story serves as a haunting reminder of the consequences of abuse, of a system that failed her, and of two people who never deserved to be parents. No amount of prison time can bring her back, but the story of her life, the story of her suffering, will never be forgotten. When the judge delivered his sentencing for Charles Pfeiffer, there was no hiding his anger and disgust. The judge described the crime as inhuman and unfathomable, underscoring the brutal nature of the abuse Leliana had endured. He couldn't fathom the depth of cruelty involved in treating a 4-year-old girl the way Charles had. The judge's words resonated in the courtroom, his frustration clear as he called Charles's actions monstrous. The judge's remarkable fury emphasized just how deeply this case had affected everyone involved, including those who had witnessed the abuse firsthand. It was evident that the brutality of the crime, the absolute disregard for Leliana's life, had left a permanent scar. The judge even went so far as to suggest that, had there been a more fitting punishment, Charles's actions would warrant something far worse than life imprisonment. Life in prison, he said, could never truly be enough to account for what Charles had done to Leliana Wright. At Charles Pfeiffer's trial, Brian Maker, Leliana's biological father, took the stand to deliver a heart-wrenching victim impact statement. His voice cracked with emotion as he recounted the final time he saw his daughter, just weeks before her tragic death. He had taken her to see Santa Claus at a local mall, an image of joy, an innocent memory that would forever be tainted by the knowledge of what was to come. Brian shared the raw grief that has haunted him ever since. His voice broke as he described how Leliana screamed when she saw her mother, Jerry, approaching their home that day, begging him not to send her back. "You should have let me have her," Brian said, his words a heartbreaking plea that was too late. He spoke about the nightmares he had, the sound of terror in his daughter's voice still echoing in his mind, a constant reminder of the pain and suffering Leliana had endured. The guilt weighed heavily on Brian. He felt as though he had failed to protect his daughter and expressed deep regret that his parents' efforts to gain custody had been unsuccessful. Leliana's death left a gaping hole in his heart, a hole that would never be filled, no matter the justice served in the courtroom. Also, in the aftermath of Leliana Wright's tragic death, the supervisor responsible for overseeing the CPS case was terminated as part of the accountability measures following the systemic failures that contributed to her death. The termination of the supervisor was part of a broader effort to hold CPS staff accountable for their roles in the failure to protect Leliana. It highlighted the agency's recognition that systemic issues, including overburdened caseworkers, lack of training, and poor communication between departments, allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. However, in an interview following Leliana's death, Charles Wayne Pfeiffer appeared surprisingly calm, almost detached, as he tried to explain his role in the tragedy. He expressed how he loved Leliana like his own, calling her his little buddy, and claiming that he missed her terribly. His words seemed rehearsed, emotionally manipulative, and self-serving. He spoke about their relationship, describing how Leliana would follow him around the house, and how he thought of her as someone who could do no wrong. Charles claimed with an almost eerie sense of innocence that Leliana's death was a tragic accident, that he never meant to harm her. He went so far as to describe her as a sweet little girl who was always so happy. Words that now, in the wake of everything that had happened, felt entirely disingenuous. His tone was too calm, his lack of urgency during the 911 call mirrored in his carefully worded statements. He denied his involvement in her abuse, claiming he could never hurt someone he loved. But this attempt at portraying himself as a loving figure fell flat, especially considering the overwhelming evidence that tied him to the brutality of the situation. The public and the investigators saw through his manipulation, recognizing that Charles had been a key figure in the cruelty Leliana endured. His words were more about protecting himself than acknowledging the horror he had inflicted. The community rallied around Leliana's memory, with public reactions pouring in from all corners. A memorial service was held in March 2016 at the Bean Massey Burge Funeral Home, and more than 60 people attended to pay their respects. Family, friends, and supporters gathered to honor the life of a little girl whose life had been tragically cut short. A candlelight vigil was also held in Mansfield, Texas, at Catherine Rose Memorial Park. The vigil was a somber occasion, with Leliana's family and supporters wearing yellow t-shirts that read, "Justice for Leliana." The bright yellow shirts, symbols of hope, courage, and the fight for justice, created a stark contrast to the tragedy that had befallen the young girl. The vigil wasn't just about honoring her life, it was also about fighting for change, about demanding accountability from the authorities and the systems that had failed her. Leliana's family, especially her grandparents, Elise and Craig Clackley, were at the forefront of this movement, speaking out publicly about their loss and their quest for justice. They wanted the world to know Leliana's story, to ensure that her death would not be in vain, and that changes would be made to prevent other children from suffering the same fate. The vigil was filled with heartfelt tributes, and those who gathered couldn't help but feel the weight of the loss, a loss that would stay with everyone who heard about Leliana's story. The fight for justice continued long after the vigil, a fight that Leliana's family would carry with them for the rest of their lives. In Galveston, Texas, the tragic case of Leliana Wright is far from an isolated incident. Over the years, child abuse rates in the city have been climbing, with the number of confirmed child abuse victims reaching as high as 7.4 per 1,000 children in recent years. In 2022, 659 confirmed child abuse victims were reported in the county alone, a sobering statistic that reflects a much larger systemic issue. What's even more troubling is the strong correlation between substance abuse and child abuse in the region. 80% of adults involved in child welfare cases are battling substance abuse problems. And in Texas, over 60% of children removed from homes cite drug abuse as a primary factor. These numbers are a clear indication that, as in Leliana's case, children are often left to suffer because of a cycle of neglect fueled by addiction. Leliana's story is just one of many, but it exemplifies the broken system that continues to fail vulnerable children. Jerry Quezada, her mother, and Charles Wayne Pfeiffer, her mother's partner, were both entrenched in a world of addiction and violence, and the system failed to intervene despite multiple signs of abuse. Just like the rising statistics in Galveston, this case reflects the tragic reality that substance abuse isn't just a personal struggle. It has far-reaching consequences, especially for children caught in the crossfire. The failure of CPS to act, despite clear warning signs, is not just an anomaly. It's a result of systemic neglect that allows children like Leliana to continue suffering. We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions. Your voice matters in these important conversations. How far should we go to ensure the safety of the vulnerable in our society? Can justice ever be truly served for a life that's been taken so unjustly? While you're here, don't forget to check out our other videos, like, and subscribe to support our channel. Together, we can keep shedding light on stories like this.